When Evan Hartley appeared outside a small store in Columbia Falls in August 2015, he was barely recognizable, barefoot, emaciated, with long hair hanging down to his chest and draped in tattered rags that no longer resembled clothing. The man had vanished 5 years earlier in one of the most remote and treacherous areas of Glacier National Park, a person whom his family and SAR teams believed had died. But the most terrifying thing was not his appearance. The most terrifying thing was what he said about those 5 years, about what had happened to him, and about the thing that still lives in the deepest darkness of the North Fork. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On September 14, 2010, Glacier National Park greeted visitors with a chilly, dew-laden morning. The changing season significantly reduced visibility on many trail sections. For Evan Hartley, a 27-year-old wildlife photographer on a 3-day solo trip, this was not just a routine shoot, but the chance to complete a photo series he had been preparing for weeks. Evan began the second day of his journey by moving from Logan Pass along the Highline Trail, planning to cross Hidden Lake Overlook and rest at Granite Park Chalet. According to statements from a group of hikers who were later interviewed by rangers, Evan appeared very enthusiastic, repeatedly lagging behind the group to adjust his camera, change lenses, and find the right angles for the rapidly shifting morning light. By mid-morning, as the trail grew slick and wet from thick mist clinging to the granite, the hikers observed Evan step a few meters off the trail to approach a herd of mountain goats moving along the mountainside, a spot just a few steps from the edge of a sheer cliff dropping into the valley below, where constant strong winds swept through and moisture from the mountain crevices made the rock surface especially slippery. They continued another quarter-mile or so before stopping at a junction between two trail branches to wait for Evan, expecting him to catch up soon after finishing his photos. 10 minutes passed, then 20. But Evan did not appear. The delay typical of a photographer quickly turned into concern. When the group backtracked to the section of trail where they had last seen Evan, the area was completely empty. Right at the edge of the dark moss-covered rock, they found a preset alloy tripod leaning dangerously toward the deep drop below. Next to it lay an open lens cap and an accessory pouch on the damp rock surface. There was no sign Evan was still in the area, nor any clear trail of movement leading back to the path or farther down the slope. The howling wind, mixed with faint echoes from the valleys, created a chaotic soundscape, swallowing the group's calls for Evan. By 10:45 p.m. that night, when Evan still had not returned to the planned meeting point, and all attempts to contact him failed, his family had no choice but to make the first missing person report to Many Glacier Ranger Station. Officially opening a case no one expected would become one of Glacier's most baffling disappearances. Just minutes after receiving the information and confirming Evan Hartley had not returned on schedule, Rangers immediately activated high-priority SAR, search and rescue procedures, for cases assessed as life-threatening in rugged terrain and deteriorating weather. A temporary command post was set up right at the Logan Pass trailhead to coordinate the entire search operation. The coordination team divided resources. Foot teams were assigned to sweep the main trail segments along the Highline, with special focus on the area where the hikers last saw Evan leave the trail. K-9 units were deployed at trail intersections to detect scent trails if any existed, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging was requested for aerial support to quickly scan steep rock faces, narrow valleys, and areas hidden from ground view. Weather conditions continued to hinder efforts. The cold mist from the previous night lingered, and low-moving clouds repeatedly reduced aerial visibility, forcing the helicopter to adjust flight paths multiple times to optimize scanning. On the ground, search teams moved slowly along steep, wet trail sections, using headlamps and marking gear to avoid missing any spots that might hold clues. The K-9 team swept from the last sighting area toward Hidden Lake Overlook, but could not establish a clear scent direction, likely due to constantly shifting strong winds and the hours that had already passed. During ground sweeps, SAR recorded no new physical evidence, such as equipment fragments, skid marks, footprints, or any survival indicators on the trail. Aerial thermal imaging also detected no notable heat signatures in rugged areas where the victim might be trapped or injured. By the end of the first search day, after combining all data from ground teams, K9 and helicopter, rangers concluded there was no evidence pinpointing Evan's current location or direction of travel after leaving the trail. The search was temporarily classified as location unknown, and SRA prepared to reassess strategy while still treating it as an urgent mission due to poor weather potentially severely reducing survival chances if the victim was injured or trapped within park boundaries. On the morning of the second search day, after compiling all data from day 1 and determining no signals pointed to Evan's location, the SRA commander decided to redeploy teams back to the area where the hikers last saw him leave the trail. This was considered the final confirmed sighting point, so all sweeps were conducted with higher detail, including stratifying the area by elevation bands, re-examining every rock surface, every gap between low shrubs, and even small water channels running parallel to the trail. Upon reaching the described spot, one SRA team spotted a small reflective object wedged between two rock slabs. After recovery and inspection, they identified it as a broken camera strap. The remaining metal clip showed signs of sudden forceful impact, unlike natural wear or ordinary drop damage. The strap matched the type Evan typically used, preliminarily verified from family-provided information. Very close to the strap location, searchers noted a long skid mark on the granite surface, starting a few meters from the trail and extending diagonally downslope. The length and angle of the skid raised questions among rangers. This was not the pattern of a natural stumble on the trail, as the mark neither paralleled nor ran perpendicular to the path, but deviated at an unusual angle, as if caused by a pulling force or uncontrolled motion right at the cliff edge. Quick discussion among team members ruled out signs of large animal activity, bear or deer, that could produce similar pushing. Expanding the sweep a few meters farther down the natural slope, the K9 team was brought in to check for scent accumulation along the skid direction. Initially, the dog gave a mild alert, indicating possible past human presence in the area, but within seconds the scent signal vanished completely. K9 could not establish Evan's next direction of travel from the rocky slope, creating a major obstacle for determining the path forward. Upon re-examining the surroundings, Sarah found no extended footprints, no claw marks, no broken low brush, and no other items beyond the recovered strap. This data led the command team to classify it as a motion interruption, a term for cases where the victim may have been suddenly affected, redirected, or involuntarily deviated from the normal route. Rangers agreed that Evan's disappearance in this area did not fit the mechanical slip-and-fall model from slippery trail conditions. Instead, indicators pointed to an anomalous event occurring precisely where the hikers last saw him. With this assessment, the SRA commander ordered an expanded search radius of 2-3 kilometers centered on the strap discovery point. The new sweep plan included dividing the terrain into small grid cells, adding more foot teams for horizontal scanning, extending K9 routes to lesser-used trail branches, and requesting lower-altitude helicopter support to search for thermal activity in narrow mountain crevices. The decision to expand the radius was based on the assumption that the victim may have been pulled downslope, slid into a hidden valley, or been displaced from his last position by a factor SAR could not yet identify. The entire team was briefed to heighten vigilance in complex terrain and to note even the smallest environmental anomalies, including fresh skids, water erosion marks, or any unnatural objects. By the end of the day's deployment, the entire 2-3 kilometers area around the strap site had been mapped, categorized by suspicion level, and photographed for later analysis. However, despite increased resources and adjusted methods, SAR still gathered no direct evidence indicating Evan's precise location or direction after the skid mark appeared. This forced the command team to maintain the location unknown assessment while preparing for the next strategic review based on the scant but unusual data collected that day. With the search radius expanded to 2-3 kilometers around the camera strap and anomalous skid mark discovery point, but still no determination of Evan Hartley's subsequent direction of travel. The 2010 SR team shifted to a more comprehensive deep search phase, focusing on complex terrain where a person could fall, be carried away, or become trapped without leaving surface signs. Helicopter support was increased, conducting multiple flyovers throughout the day along the entire western flank of the Highline Trail, particularly the Garden Wall area, where sheer cliffs extend hundreds of meters and are frequent sites of falls inaccessible from the ground. Thermal imaging was used continuously during periods of clearest surface temperature contrast to detect any anomalous heat signatures against rock and vegetation, but morning, midday, and afternoon flights recorded no unusual hot spots. The helicopter then shifted to deeper scans of Swift Current Valley, where the broad valley terrain includes narrow gorges and deep crevices that could conceal a victim from ground observation. The pilot maintained the lowest safe altitude to aid direct visual observation, while SAR technicians checked reflective surfaces, foreign objects, brightly colored clothing, or any signals potentially related to Evan's position, but results remained unchanged: no signs of life, no fresh movement traces, no additional personal items. In parallel with aerial operations, ground SAR teams swept valley bottoms and transition zones between trails and low brush areas. Teams were divided along two branches leading into Swift Current Valley, crossing natural gullies formed by water runoff from cliffs. In these areas, searchers used anchor ropes and climbing harnesses to descend into depressions where a fallen person might lodge, but hours of continuous inspection revealed no fabric scraps, equipment fragments, or secondary skid marks. At cliff face zones, rangers conducted high-magnification binocular scans, examining rock faces vertically for fresh impact scratches from body or gear collisions, but all observations showed no recent surface disturbances. SAR next turned to inspecting fissures and narrow rock crevices. Many of these were just wide enough for a person to fall into but difficult to access due to variable depth and rock debris. Specialized teams lowered cable-mounted cameras into each crevice, rotating and illuminating the interior space in hopes of detecting signs of the missing person. However, more than 10 crevices examined showed no gear or evidence consistent with Evan. During the search, another factor received attention: small meltwater ponds around high-elevation areas. Some lay directly below trails Evan may have crossed. SAR used probing poles, drag nets, and underwater cameras to inspect pond bottoms and rule out the possibility of a slip into water. But the clear water and low temperatures allowed good visibility, enabling SAR to quickly conclude that ponds near the skid area contained no body or submerged items. When all most likely search routes had been repeatedly swept with no progress, the SR command began compiling a summary report, evaluating time factors, terrain, weather, and field data. According to accident probability models for this area, a person leaving the trail in thick mist and on slick rock is highly likely to slip off the path and fall into deep slopes where remains are difficult to locate in the initial phase. The broken camera strap and long granite skid mark were deemed consistent with a strong slip scenario beginning at the cliff edge position. Combined with the lack of survival signs from helicopter and K9 within the expanded radius, SAR concluded that field evidence strongly favored the victim having fallen into a crevice or location too hazardous for visual detection, resulting in death. 3 days later, with no new signs and worsening weather increasing risks to search personnel, the SR commander held a final evaluation meeting and officially classified the case as presumed deceased. The 2010 file on Evan Hartley's disappearance was closed on that basis, with the determination that the victim most likely perished in an accident while off-trail, and that recovery of remains was not feasible within the scope of available search methods. Nearly 5 years after Evan Hartley's missing persons case was closed as presumed deceased, on a morning in mid-August 2015, an emergency call was transferred to the local police department in Columbia Falls, reporting that a man in severe distress was staggering along the roadside near the intersection with Highway 2. The witness described the man as emaciated to the point of being skin and bones, with tattered clothing, bare feet, and apparent disorientation. When police approached, they noted several abnormal signs. The man did not respond appropriately to questions, had weak breathing, glassy eyes, and could barely stand upright. The most striking detail was a series of small sounds he kept repeating. A halting, fragmented whisper that at times sounded like he was trying to say his own name. Emergency medical personnel arrived minutes later, conducted an initial assessment, and recommended immediate transport to the nearest hospital. As he was placed on the stretcher, he turned his head and uttered two words that sounded muffled but clearer than his previous sounds. Evan Hartley. Police immediately recorded this information, cross-checked it against Montana's missing persons database, and recognized that the name just spoken matched the case closed in 2010 at Glacier National Park. Although further verification was required, they treated it as a significant lead, with a high likelihood that this emaciated man was the presumed deceased victim. The man was transported to the emergency department at the hospital in Kalispell in a state of severe dehydration, extreme malnutrition, hypothermia, and with multiple old wounds on his body. Doctors stabilized his vital signs and noted that the patient gave vague responses to sounds resembling proper names. This prompted the hospital to create a file and notify police, requesting assistance in identity verification. Meanwhile, Columbia Falls Police completed internal reporting procedures and contacted Glacier National Park Rangers, the agency that had handled the 2010 missing persons case. The reappearance of someone presumed dead after nearly 5 years in a small town just a few miles from the park boundary triggered a high level of alert. Verification needed to be swift, accurate, and confidential. Glacier Rangers requested comparison of physical description, old scars, height, and identifying photos from the 2010 file. When the hospital provided description was sent over, numerous matching features emerged: age range, height, jawline shape, and the location of an old scar on the right hand. This was sufficient to consider a probable identity match, though biometric and DNA comparison was still required for confirmation. While formal verification procedures were underway, Rangers contacted Evan's family, informing them that an individual matching the description had appeared in the vicinity of Glacier and was receiving treatment at Kalispell Hospital. The family was asked not to publicize the information and to maintain confidentiality to avoid interfering with the verification process. Their initial emotional response, a mixture of hope and skepticism, was noted in the intake report, as this was the first indication since 2010 that Evan might still be alive. Authorities requested additional identifying data from the family: photos of scars, ear structure, clothing styles, and accessories he commonly used on trips, and prior dental records. These materials were promptly forwarded to the hospital for preliminary comparison. When the hospital sent close-up facial photos of the patient, Glacier Rangers reported an almost absolute similarity. That same day, internal communications among the hospital, Columbia Falls Police, and Glacier Rangers documented a high probability that the man found was Evan Hartley. Based on this assessment, the legal status of the 2010 case immediately changed from presumed deceased, a conclusion based on circumstances without a body, to victim located alive, case reassessment required, meaning the victim had been found alive, and a full case review was mandatory. This included reopening all 2010 data, re-examining initial information, and preparing to evaluate factors that could explain the victim's disappearance for multiple years. Relevant agencies were notified that the case had shifted from a routine search and rescue matter to one requiring a full reinvestigation of the circumstances of disappearance. New pressures emerged: the reason Evan reappeared after 5 years in such a depleted state, where he had been during that time, and especially why he had been unable to contact anyone or return earlier before being discovered near Columbia Falls. While Evan remained in emergency medical care at Kalispell, Glacier's old case files began to be reopened in preparation for the next evaluation phase, officially marking the transition of the incident from an presumed accident to a returned victim case with many unexplained details. At Kalispell Hospital, after the man's minimal vital signs were stabilized, formal identity verification procedures were initiated under coordinated request from Columbia Falls Police, Glacier National Park Rangers, and the Montana State Forensics Division. The first step was collecting biological samples for DNA analysis, this being the required method for long-term missing persons found in debilitated condition or unable to self-identify. Forensic staff collected oral mucosa samples and compared them against Evan Hartley's DNA profile stored in the 2010 missing persons file. While awaiting DNA results, the hospital and rangers proceeded with supplementary physical identification, comparing cheekbone shape, jawline, forehead, skeletal proportions, and asymmetry features documented in Evan's prior personal photos. An orthopedic doctor participating in the examination identified a scar running along the right wrist that matched an injury Evan had sustained during college. His 2006 medical records documented the location and characteristics of this scar. A second matching feature was a small scar near the left heel, formed from a minor injury during a hiking trip 6 years before his disappearance. These matches were not ultimately conclusive on their own, but strengthened the hypothesis that the man found was highly likely the 2010 victim. Additionally, the hospital performed X-rays of the jaw and teeth for comparison with the dental records provided by Evan's family at the time of the missing persons report. The dental file included full mouth X-rays from 2009, detailing filling locations, wisdom tooth structure, lower incisor misalignment, and the root shape of tooth #14. When the two sets were compared side by side, doctors observed near-perfect correspondence, old filling positions, root angulation, crown length, and rare features, such as minor enamel chipping on tooth #8, all matched completely. In identity verification procedures, dental comparison is generally considered the second highest reliability method after DNA. And such complete correspondence indicated an extremely low probability of error. Meanwhile, the forensics lab in Helena worked continuously to expedite analysis. Modern forensic technology shortened wait times, and by the afternoon of the following day, the DNA comparison report was returned. The DNA sequence from the man at Kalispell matched 100% with Evan Hartley's 2010 stored sample. This conclusion met all identification standards, absolute accuracy with no possibility of misidentification. Once DNA was authenticated, administrative procedures immediately changed. The patient's identity was confirmed as Evan Hartley, 32-year-old male, reported missing from Glacier on September 14, 2010. This information was promptly conveyed to the family along with notification that Evan was alive, receiving medical care, and required intensive monitoring for safety. Immediately after identity confirmation, once Evan's vital signs had stabilized at a minimal level, Kalispell Hospital shifted to comprehensive medical evaluation to determine what his body had endured during nearly 5 years of disappearance. This critical step laid the foundation for reorienting the entire understanding of the missing case. The nutrition and internal medicine team began with overall assessment. Evan's weight was nearly 40% below his 2010 records, BMI in the severe malnutrition range, clear muscle wasting, and almost complete loss of subcutaneous fat, all reflecting prolonged energy deficit. Blood tests continued to show severely reduced total protein, albumin, and fat-soluble vitamins, especially vitamin D, which plays a key role in bone health. Vitamin D levels were abnormally low, even lower than in cases of prolonged residence in low sunlight regions, leading doctors to suspect Evan had spent most of his time in an environment with virtually no natural light exposure. Next came skeletal and muscular evaluations. Full-body X-rays revealed multiple abnormalities. Ribs 6 and 7 had previously fractured and healed without treatment, evidenced by slight misalignment at the callus and reduced bone density around load-bearing sites. The left tibia also showed signs of prior heavy impact, leaving an old, unevenly healed crack. These injuries were inconsistent with a single accident and suggested repeated trauma over an extended period without medical intervention. Overall bone density was far below average for a man of his age, indeed lower than commonly seen in the elderly, indicating prolonged severe immobility. Orthopedic specialists paid particular attention to muscle atrophy in the legs and lower back. The degree of atrophy meant Evan could only stand with support, and muscle distribution was uneven, suggesting long-term disuse immobility similar to cases of confinement in confined spaces. On the skin surface, the dermatology team noted a series of lesions typical of prolonged exposure to damp, poorly ventilated environments. Wrists and ankles showed darkened, hardened, coal-used rings consistent with repeated friction from hard material, possibly restraints. Both wrists displayed flat, arc-shaped calluses distributed symmetrically, not the pattern seen in climbing injuries. Old abrasions on the back and shoulders indicated repeated contact with hard objects, while the lower neck area showed dark linear indentations, possibly from bearing weight on the shoulders in a restrained or forced-down posture over extended periods. Additional internal medicine findings included signs of chronic dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and severe iron deficiency, consistent with a highly restricted nutrient-poor diet. Oral mucosa damage and mild persistent gingivitis were also consistent with poor hygiene living conditions. When synthesizing all medical data, the specialist team concluded that Evan's injury pattern was incompatible with any natural survival model in Glacier's mountain wilderness. A person surviving years in the wild would show heavy sun exposure, insect bites, higher vitamin D levels, and body adaptations from constant movement to forage. In contrast, Evan's body exhibited characteristics of confinement in an enclosed or low-light space, extremely restricted mobility, and tightly controlled minimal nutrition. Furthermore, the presence of healed untreated fractures, together with repeated indentations at fixed locations, were hallmark indicators in long-term captivity cases, where victims are often restrained in posture or movement by bindings or confinement devices. One evaluating physician noted in the report, "The entire injury pattern cannot match any natural survival model. Skeletal, dermal, and muscular data all point to controlled mobility restriction." The hospital's preliminary medical conclusion, forwarded to authorities the same day, stated clearly, Evan Hartley could not have survived 5 years in natural wilderness conditions. Instead, his body clearly reflected the characteristics of a long-term controlled captivity victim. From this conclusion, the original 2010 assessment that Evan perished in an accident after leaving the trail was formally ruled out on medical grounds. The documented injuries not only refuted the natural survival scenario, but also mandated a full reinvestigation of the entire context behind his nearly 5-year disappearance, as such injuries could not have formed without human intervention or a deliberately controlled environment. After completing the medical evaluation, which showed that the injuries on Evan Hartley's body were consistent with a pattern of long-term captivity, the hospital in Kalispell collaborated with a team of clinical psychologists specializing in captivity victims to conduct an in-depth psychological assessment. The goal was to determine the extent of psychological trauma and behavioral responses that could help identify the cause of his nearly 5-year disappearance. The evaluation process began by testing Evan's reactions to basic stimuli, including light, sound, and surrounding movement. Doctors gradually increased the intensity of each type of stimulus to observe his natural responses. When the overhead room light was turned on, at a normal hospital room level, Evan immediately squinted, turned his face away, and tried to raise his hand to shield his eyes, showing clear discomfort with a brightness that would not be excessive for a normal person. This aligned with the hypothesis that he had lived in a prolonged, low-light environment. When the light was increased one level further, Evan became disoriented and breathed rapidly, with his body slightly curling inward. The doctor had to reduce the brightness back to a low level. For auditory stimuli, the specialists tested sounds such as a door opening, footsteps, and light metal scraping on a tabletop. Every time a metallic sound occurred, Evan exhibited a pronounced startle reflex. His shoulders hunched, and both hands moved close to his chest in a self-protective mechanism. When a sudden door-opening sound came from behind, Evan immediately leaned to the right and pulled his legs up onto the bed, displaying an instinctive avoidance of danger rather than the calm response typical of a normal person. The specialists noted that his reactions were not merely startles, but included conditioned defensive movements, a type of reflex commonly seen in victims who have been assaulted, threatened, or controlled over an extended period. The next test involved responses to movement. When a doctor moved quickly into his field of vision, Evan tended to shrink back, slightly twisting his body as if clearing a path, and took several seconds to reorient himself. In contrast, when the doctor approached slowly from the front and announced each action in advance, Evan showed significantly less anxiety. This indicated that he had developed a high level of hypervigilance toward sudden movements, a characteristic consistent with long-term captivity victims who live in threatening, unpredictable environments controlled by their captor. Following the stimulus evaluation, the psychology team continued observing body language and spontaneous behaviors. Evan frequently sat hunched over, with both hands drawn close to his chest. His hands occasionally clenched lightly in an irregular rhythm, indicating a baseline state of tension. When someone entered the room without him first recognizing their footsteps, Evan would quickly turn his face toward the door and then immediately lower his head. A classic defensive behavior aimed at reducing the risk of confrontation. The team recorded an additional noteworthy detail when a doctor accidentally dropped a pen on the floor, creating a sharp sound. Evan reacted so quickly that he twisted his body toward the edge of the bed in a fraction of a second, a speed far exceeding the normal reflex of a healthy adult. This reflected that he had once lived in a state of constant high alertness where any sudden sound carried potential threat. These repeated manifestations, exaggerated startle responses, shrinking back, hypersensitivity to metallic sounds, and active defensive reflexes, matched the pattern of conditioned threat response, a form of psychological adaptation seen in victims subjected to controlled long-term confinement. Beyond instinctive reactions, the specialists also assessed Evan's communication ability. Although he remained weak and struggled to form complete sentences, most of the words he uttered related to confined, dark spaces, such as no light or door closed. Each time he mentioned door, he would typically glance toward the room door and then lower his gaze, indicating that this keyword was strongly linked to a highly stressful experience. When a doctor reached out to test his reflexes, Evan tended to recoil before allowing contact, similar to the behavior of someone who had been restrained or subjected to strict supervision. The specialists also conducted tests of spatial and temporal orientation. Evan had difficulty identifying basic time markers, but reacted strongly when concepts related to being locked up or unable to get out were mentioned. This reinforced the assumption that he had lived in an environment with restricted movement and a lack of temporal information for an extended period. In the comprehensive report, the psychology team concluded that Evan displayed the full pattern of a long-term captivity victim: hypersensitive reflexes, avoidance of bright light, anxiety triggered by metallic sounds, shrinking behavior, fear of sudden human presence, and impaired temporal orientation. These signs could not emerge if he had survived in a natural environment or under conditions of freedom. They were only consistent with prolonged isolation, surveillance, or confinement. Based on the behavioral and neurological assessment, the expert team asserted that Evan's case could not be viewed as the result of an accident or prolonged lost-in-the-wilderness incident. Instead, it must be approached from the perspective of human criminal intervention. Based on this analysis, law enforcement updated the investigative direction. Rather than seeking explanations in a wilderness survival context, the case needed to be examined as a disappearance involving human interference, in which the victim was maintained in a controlled state of captivity for a significant period before being found in 2015. After the medical and psychological evaluations confirmed long-term captivity indicators on Evan Hartley, authorities shifted to reconstructing the full timeline of September 14, 2010, to determine what actually happened during the period he went missing. The investigation team recontacted every hiker who had provided information during the 2010 SARA phase, asking them to re-describe in detail their routes, times, locations, and weather conditions when they encountered Evan. One group of hikers reported that they started from Logan Pass around 9 a.m. and first encountered Evan along the Highline Trail near midday. They described him setting up a tripod to take photos, appearing cheerful and not disoriented. According to them, the morning weather was quite good, with visibility sufficient to clearly see the trail sections ahead. About 30 minutes later, as they continued hiking and glanced back, they saw Evan leave the trail a few meters toward the cliff edge to approach a herd of mountain goats. When asked for the precise time, the hikers estimated between 11:15 and 11:30 a.m., consistent with the lighting and shadow directions they recalled. The investigation team cross-referenced this with metadata from photos Evan had taken earlier, confirming that at approximately 11:20 a.m., he was indeed near Hidden Lake Overlook and had photographed the goats from an angle off the trail. Thus, Evan's last confirmed sighting location was clearly established: the cliff edge area with a gentle rocky slope only a few meters from the main trail. When the team asked the hikers about any unusual movements or strange sounds, one member recalled that a few minutes after they left the area, they heard a somewhat vague sound, a very faint metallic noise or something sliding on rock, but it was not clear enough to be considered a danger sign, so they continued without turning back to check. This detail was not deemed significant in 2010 due to the lack of additional clues at the time, but in the 2015 context, given Evan's strong reactions to metallic sounds and the presence of an anomalous slide mark at the scene, it became far more noteworthy. The team continued to cross-check travel times between points based on Evan's average hiking speed from prior trips. The distance from Logan Pass to the encounter location was consistent with him not having encountered any incident or become lost before that point. Weather records from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on September 14, 2010, from the meteorological station showed gradually increasing mist but no strong winds or rain, meaning environmental conditions were insufficient to cause a natural slip and fall at a location so close to the trail. Investigators also reviewed topographic maps and determined that if Evan had truly slipped from that position, his body would have fallen onto the vegetation below or struck rock ledges, areas that the 2010 SR team had thoroughly searched with flyovers and thermal imaging, but found no biological traces or belongings whatsoever. When reconstructing the period from 11:30 a.m. until complete loss of contact, the team determined that within less than 15 minutes after the last hiker sighting, Evan had vanished from the area in a manner that left no natural traces. Combined with the broken camera strap, the anomalously directed slide mark, and signs of interrupted movement, the team ruled out a simple accident. No data indicated that Evan had wandered off, become disoriented, or become trapped in a natural crevice. The above factors indicated that the disappearance could not be explained by environmental elements. Instead, all details aligned more logically with intervention by another individual within a very short window immediately after the final hiker sighting. The timeline reconstruction conclusion stated clearly, Evan did not suffer an accident on the trail. No natural mechanism could account for his disappearance without leaving traces, and all indicators pointed to the likelihood that he was approached, impacted, or subdued by another person in that area. This conclusion officially removed the case from the realm of a mountain accident and reclassified it as involving human intervention. After the September 14, 2010, timeline reconstruction showed that no natural mechanism could explain Evan's disappearance within minutes of his last sighting by hikers. The investigation team turned to analyzing digital data recovered from his personal belongings. Among the items Evan carried on that trip, only a small portion was recovered during his initial return in 2015, including an old memory card that was slightly bent at the edges but still recoverable. The card was sent to a specialized digital forensics lab where technicians used advanced software to recover all deleted files, corrupted files, and damaged sectors. The recovery process took several days due to physical damage to the card, but the results revealed over 300 photos taken during the first 2 days of the trip. Most were landscapes, wildlife, and characteristic shots consistent with Evan's photography habits. However, the team paid particular attention to files captured between 10:45 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., the timeframe corresponding to the final hiker's sighting. Metadata analysis determined that the last photo was taken at 11 hours 22 minutes and 17 seconds a.m. This image was right before Evan left the trail to approach the mountain goats. Based on EXIF data, the camera was tilted slightly left, with a small aperture for greater depth of field, and the lens direction matched the hiker's description of Evan facing the mountainside off the trail. However, when technicians expanded the shadow area behind and increased contrast at the frame edges, they detected an anomaly absent from earlier photos, a vertical dark shape positioned off to the right edge of the frame, not matching any natural terrain feature in the area. Initially, the dark area could have been a tree shadow or light interference, but comparison with other photos Evan took the same day at the same geographic location confirmed that no large trees, standing rocks or natural objects in that direction could produce such a vertical shape. For further verification, the analysis team magnified the anomalous area 400% and reprocessed it with edge enhancement algorithms. The results showed that the object's outline did not match any recorded rock formations. The straight edges and slightly wider top, tapering downward, approximated the proportions of a standing human figure. This was the first indication that another individual may have appeared in the area directly behind Evan at the moment the final photo was taken. EXIF data also indicated that the light source at that time came from the front and slightly right of Evan's position, casting the object behind him fully into shadow, making it impossible to see clearly with the naked eye, especially while Evan was focused on the goats ahead. The analysis team further examined photos taken immediately before and after the final one. The two preceding images showed no similar object, reinforcing the hypothesis that the human-like shape appeared only briefly and remained stationary or moved minimally. A motion analysis technician noted, if the object resulted from light error or wind-displaced terrain material, it would not maintain such a clear vertical shape. The object's static nature in the single frame aligned more closely with a person standing in an observational position behind Evan. To strengthen the conclusion, the team reconstructed the shooting position using digital terrain data for hidden lake overlook and reference points from the remaining images. In the 3D model, they determined that the object must have stood at least 3-5 meters behind Evan and slightly to the right, at a vantage point, offering a clear view of both Evan and the goat herd area. This was an ideal position for observing or approaching a victim from behind without being noticed by other hikers. In the final part of the digital analysis, the team re-examined a corrupted data segment on the memory card, where the system recorded a video fragment lasting less than 1 second before failure. After reconstruction with recovery software, the technicians obtained 3 incomplete frames. In the second frame, a fast-moving shadow appeared at the frame's edge, with contours suggesting the motion of an arm or upper body advancing toward the camera. Although high noise levels prevented clear identification, the team determined this was not an animal due to the height and movement direction not matching patterns of local wildlife. Moreover, metadata confirmed Evan was stationary when the video segment activated, possibly triggered inadvertently when he turned or reacted suddenly to a sound from behind, consistent with the hiker's report of a faint metallic noise. Synthesizing all digital data, the analysis team reached a clear conclusion: Evan Hartley was approached by another individual immediately before his disappearance. The final photo and video frames not only ruled out Evan being alone in the area, but also showed the presence of another person in very close proximity, not by chance. Based on the technical analyses, The investigation team asserted that this approach occurred within a time frame differing by no more than a few minutes from the last hiker's sighting, meaning human intervention was the decisive factor in his vanishing from the location in an extremely short period without leaving natural traces. After digital evidence confirmed that Evan Hartley had been approached by an individual immediately prior to his disappearance, the investigative team proceeded with environmental forensic analysis based on microparticle samples collected from his body at Kalispell Hospital in order to determine the environment in which Evan had lived during nearly 5 years of captivity. First, experts analyzed soil samples found under his fingernails, in skin crevices, and on the soles of his feet, locations that typically retain environmental microparticles from prolonged contact. Mineralogical analysis revealed soil with characteristic composition, including weathered basalt grains, fragmented silica, and a high proportion of glacial till minerals, all matching soil samples collected along the North Fork area in the northwest of the park, near the North Fork Flathead River. Notably, this soil type does not appear in the trail area where Evan vanished in 2010. Particularly around Logan Pass or Hidden Lake Overlook, where the dominant geology consists of granitic bedrock and fine soil mixed with small gravel from glacial melt. The presence of North Fork characteristic soil indicates Evan had prolonged contact with an area far from his disappearance location, even outside the search and rescue SAR grid thoroughly covered in 2010. This analysis immediately ruled out the possibility that Evan had been trapped near the trail or in terrain similar to the disappearance site. Next, the environmental forensics team examined soot particles adhering to Evan's torn clothing and hair. The soot was analyzed using FTIR infrared spectroscopy, revealing degraded lignin and cellulose molecules at low-temperature charring, characteristic of wood burning in a closed stove rather than open-air fires. The soot sample also contained markers of lodgepole pine wood, a tree common in the western forest belt of Glacier, but rare along the central trail areas. More importantly, the soot showed signs of combustion in an oxygen-deficient environment, evidenced by a higher-than-average ratio of unburned carbon. This indicated a heat source generated in a controlled enclosed space and used repeatedly over many years, suggesting the existence of a shelter or holding structure equipped with a closed combustion device, an element absent in natural forest environments. Dust samples collected from Evan's skin surface were also cross-referenced with similar soot samples gathered from abandoned cabins around the North Fork area, to identify any matches between location and evidence. Preliminary results showed that several old cabins in the forest had similar stove types, but none were located near Evan's disappearance site, further reinforcing the hypothesis that the holding location was not near the trail. In parallel, the microbiology lab conducted analysis of fungal spores found on his hair, skin, and fabric adhering closely to his body. A high-density strain present was Cladosporium and Aspergillus, two fungi characteristic of enclosed, damp, low-light environments. They commonly occur in old wooden structures, cellars, abandoned sheds, or long unventilated confined spaces. The spore concentration in the samples was abnormally high, far exceeding levels possible for someone living in a natural outdoor environment, even in rock crevices or temporary forest camps. This indicated Evan had lived in a damp, dark, and poorly ventilated environment for an extended period, consistent with all prior medical and psychological data obtained. Additionally, the fungal spore samples contained a small amount of mold hyphae decomposing from structural wood, a type commonly found in old cabins in the North Fork area and remote forested regions west of the park, where the humid climate combined with freeze-thaw cycles creates favorable conditions for rapid fungal growth. Taken together, the three sets of results, soil mineralogy, wood soot, and fungal spores, all converged on a consistent conclusion. The environment in which Evan was held was not near his 2010 disappearance area, and certainly not in natural rock crevices around the trail. Soil characteristics showed a clear shift toward the North Fork, Wood soot pointed to a human-made heat source in an enclosed space, and fungal spores proved a high humidity, very low light, spatially restricted holding environment. These were hallmark signs of a fixed, man-made wooden structure such as a cabin, shed, or similar enclosed space, rather than open outdoor terrain. Based on this analysis, the investigative team narrowed the search radius to the forested areas northwest of Glacier, including zones adjacent to the North Fork Flathead River, where dozens of private cabins, abandoned sheds, old hunting camps, and even some sites used as temporary shelters, but abandoned since the 1980s exist. The most critical point was that all samples indicated Evan had lived, moved, or been held in a relatively stable location for a prolonged period, not continuously changing positions or living outdoors. These environmental forensic results became the key scientific basis for redirecting the investigation toward the North Fork area and entirely excluding the Central Park region from the circle of suspicion. As a result, authorities entered the next phase with a clearer geographic scope and a sufficiently strong evidentiary foundation to assert the place Evan was taken after his disappearance was completely separate from the initial disappearance location and lay deep within an isolated forested area northwest of Glacier, where a maintained holding structure could plausibly have existed for many years. After environmental forensic analysis indicated that Evan Hartley had been in an enclosed structure in the forested region northwest of Glacier, the federal investigative team coordinated with rangers to conduct ground surveys in the area around the North Fork Flathead River, where the terrain is complex, sparsely populated, and contains many old cabins abandoned for decades. The survey team employed strip search methods combined with GPS equipment and flyover recordings of vegetation anomalies to identify unusual trails. On the very first day, they discovered a narrow path deep within the lodgepole pine forest that did not appear on any official park maps. The path was only about 40–50 centimeters wide, indicating it was not used by large animals, and showed signs of deliberate camouflage, numerous broken branches propped alternately along both sides, with some bushes intentionally pulled over to cover the edges. These features did not match natural growth patterns, but aligned with human intervention to prevent the trail from being visible on satellite imagery. Advancing approximately 200 meters into the path, the team recorded faint but still discernible tire tracks. The size and tread pattern matched an older pre-2000 ATV tire type, a vehicle still used by some off-grid residents in the North Fork area, though largely prohibited in zones bordering the national park. The wheelbase distance suggested the vehicle had carried heavy loads, possibly materials or supplies on a regular basis. Notably, the tracks did not continue uninterrupted, but terminated at a low-lying area covered by thick moss, though soil compression beneath indicated the vehicle had stopped there multiple times in the past. Environmental technicians determined the compacted soil layer was no more than 10 years old, meaning activity in this area overlapped with the period of Evan's disappearance. In addition, while sweeping the area along the trail edges, the team found a clear footprint impressed in damp soil, approximately size 11. What made the print particularly distinctive was not just the size, but the unusual length-to-width ratio combined with abnormal heel depth, indicating the individual who left it had significantly above-average body weight. Measurements confirmed this footprint did not match any from search teams or rangers in the area. Since the damp soil preserved the impression well, the team cast a silicone mold for shoe sole analysis. Footwear experts identified the sole as belonging to a work boot model released in the early 1990s, now rarely used, especially near the park. Finding a size 11 footprint with this uncommon sole pattern in a context lacking signs of legal activity raised suspicion that it could belong to the individual who maintained Evan's holding site. Expanding the survey radius around the tire tracks and footprint, rangers identified at least 3 secondary paths penetrating deeper into the forest. each ranging from 80 to over 200 meters long, all created by cutting or bending saplings in the same direction, clear signs of intentional human travel routes rather than animal paths. These secondary paths formed a narrowing network toward the northwest, leading to a small flat clearing behind a dense forest belt, a location with concealed terrain invisible from the main road. Topographic maps of the North Fork region showed this area once had several hunter cabins documented in 1970s, 1980s records, later declared abandoned and unmaintained. However, the tire tracks, footprint, and camouflage trails suggested one of these old structures may have continued in unauthorized use. During infrared scanning to detect unusual temperature differentials along the ground and forest canopy, the technical support team recorded 2 stable low-heat anomalies, suggesting the presence of covered man-made objects, possibly wooden foundations or structure roofs partially obscured by soil and moss. The scan results were insufficient to precisely identify the structure type, but sufficient to place the area on the priority access list. After 3 days of surveying, the combined evidence, including the camouflage trail, old ATV tire tracks, rare size 11 footprint, network of secondary paths leading to a concealed zone, and low heat points, indicated a pattern of prolonged illegal land use, consistent with a stably operated holding site over many years. From the collected data, the team delineated a suspect radius of approximately 1.5 kilometers around the tire track and footprint location. This was considered a high-probability zone containing Evan Hartley's holding site throughout his disappearance. After narrowing the suspect area based on the camouflage trail, old ATV tire tracks, and rare size 11 footprint, the investigative team conducted a synchronized grid search of the dense forest northwest of North Fork, dividing into teams with progressively tightening radii. Near the end of the 4th survey day, a ranger spotted an anomaly, a cluster of trees growing in an unnatural arc, with small branches bent inward rather than outward as normal growth would dictate. Upon closer approach, the team realized that behind the thick undergrowth was the wooden wall of an old cabin, covered by faded brown camouflage netting, with moss and dead branches layered on top to completely conceal it from distant view. The cabin appeared on no park structure maps or North Fork property management records, indicating it had existed outside official oversight for a long time. Inspecting the cabin perimeter, the team found additional indirect evidence of use for over a decade: an old steel wire segment used for hanging animal traps, a compacted soil patch forming an ATV parking spot now regrown with vegetation, and wood ash traces matching samples analyzed from Evan's hair and clothing. The cabin had a thick wooden main door secured with a rusty but still functional latch. The team used specialized lock-breaking tools to open it, documenting the scene upon entry. Inside, the cabin had a strong musty odor consistent with the fungal spores collected from Evan's body, and very dim light because all windows were boarded over from the inside with multiple layers of planks. The structure consisted of a small main room and a narrow side annex, but what drew the team's attention most was an old rug laid in the center of the main room, out of place amid the otherwise aged furnishings. Lifting the rug revealed a thick wooden trapdoor with heavy hinges and a large iron hasp locked from above. Beneath the wood was a thin metal lining, a deliberate reinforcement to prevent sound from escaping below. Once unlocked, the trapdoor was lifted, exposing a deep, dark opening leading to an enclosed space beneath the cabin. The descending ladder was made of old steel, showing rust but remaining sturdy, proving repeated past use. When the team switched on lights and descended, they found themselves in a confinement cell roughly 3 square meters in size, with 3 thick wooden walls reinforced by metal bars and 1 compacted earth wall. The ceiling was low, with no windows and only a very small ventilation slit near the top, barely allowing any natural light. Inside the room, evidence was so abundant that its function was unmistakable. In the left corner was a heavy chain anchored to the wall with deeply drilled bolts, the chain length only about 1.5 meters, severely restricting movement for anyone attached. Close inspection showed the chain end had a shackle matching indentations around Evan's ankles and wrists. The darkened skin marks aligned precisely with the wall attachment height. In the right corner stood a small iron-framed bed with only a steel mesh surface. Remnants of old fabric remained, identified as degraded synthetic blanket fibers. The bed surface showed deep wear depressions corresponding to adult hip and shoulder positions, indicating long-term use. Particularly striking was the wall opposite the bed, covered with hundreds of regularly clustered scratch marks. The marks were grouped in sets of 4 vertical lines crossed by 1 diagonal, a classic manual tally system commonly used by long-term captives. The sheer number of marks made quick counting impossible, covering nearly the entire wall length. Based on dust, layering and scratch depth, forensic experts determined the marks had been made continuously over many years, aligning with the period of Evan's disappearance. Near the wall, the team found a rusted metal can used as a water container and a bent spoon with human tooth impressions on the metal, indicating the victim had used it under conditions of extreme deprivation of basic utensils. The cell floor contained other key evidence, such as worn wood fragments possibly from prolonged foot rubbing and fungal dust distribution matching spores from Evan's hair. During DNA collection, samples were taken from the chain, iron bed, wall surfaces, and trapdoor edges, all locations likely to retain shed skin cells from captivity. Preliminary on-site spectroscopic analysis detected biological markers consistent with human DNA, but for definitive confirmation, all samples were sealed and sent to the state lab. Notably, the trapdoor area showed 2 mixed DNA profiles, one matching Evan's record and a second unidentified profile, likely belonging to the cabin operator or an associated individual. Beyond DNA, mechanical traces around the trapdoor included fresher scratches than surrounding wood, indicating the trapdoor had been opened from above, not long before discovery, suggesting the site may have been hastily abandoned or the operator departed after Evan escaped or was removed. All features of the confinement room matched Evan's physical injuries. The low ceiling explained reduced bone density from lack of movement, absence of natural light, aligned with extremely low vitamin D levels, and fixed chains corresponded to wrist and ankle indentations. The presence of the iron bed, tally marks, and fully enclosed space eliminated all doubt. This cabin was the site where Evan had been held for many years. The collected evidence was sufficient to conclude that the holding environment was stable, purposefully operated, and sustained over a period corresponding to nearly 5 years of Evan's disappearance. The cabin was no longer a hypothesis, but physical proof of a human-engineered captivity system. After the holding cabin was identified as the location where Evan Hartley had been imprisoned for many years, DNA samples collected from the chains, iron bed, and trapdoor edges were urgently transferred to the state laboratory for in-depth analysis. The second DNA sample, not belonging to Evan, became the primary focus in the effort to identify the individual who had operated this structure. Once the data was fully sequenced, the forensic team proceeded to compare it against the federal CODIS system. A partial DNA match was found with an unidentified profile from a 2008 investigation involving stalking and threats on private property in the outskirts of Columbia Falls. However, since the suspect had never been arrested at that time, no full profile existed for a direct link. This partial match prompted the CODIS system to automatically suggest that the sample cluster originated from the North Fork residential area, opening up a potential group of individuals who had lived semi-isolated in the forest. When the query was expanded to demographic databases and non-conviction criminal records in the region, the investigation team found a standout result. The complex cabin DNA data partially matched genetic traces collected in 2008 from items left behind at the scene of a failed burglary suspected to involve a man named Colton Reddick, though he was never prosecuted. This match was not only in individual gene loci, but also in characteristic haplotype boundaries spanning 2 generations in the same area, allowing investigators to narrow the scope to a specific individual. From there, Colton Reddick's file was reopened. Reddick was born and raised in North Fork, living scattered among the forest northwest of Glacier, where the cabin holding Evan was discovered. Public property records showed that Reddick had registered ownership of a temporary cabin in 1996, but the documented location did not match the newly discovered holding cabin. However, deeper checks revealed that Reddick had submitted a request to repair an ATV trail in 1999, a trail with width and wheelbase specifications matching the tracks found around the cabin. Investigators also discovered that Reddick had a history of domestic violence that never reached court due to victims withdrawing complaints, along with reports of confrontational behavior toward rangers in the North Fork area throughout the early 2000s. Most notably, the 2008 record showed multiple local residents reporting a large-built man wearing old work boots appearing near abandoned sheds, sometimes following tourist vehicles that strayed into the forest area. When the incidents were reported to local police, an officer noted size 11 footprints at one scene, consistent with the footprints found at Evan's holding cabin. Also in that year, a woman living scattered in the North Fork forest reported that a strange man attempted to approach her at night, but when she screamed, he fled, leaving behind a torn glove matching the unidentified DNA profile entered into the system at the time. The case was quickly closed for lack of evidence, but the cabin DNA data now fully reconnected the loose threads from 2008. The federal investigation team continued searching for Reddick's activity markers during the period Evan went missing. Former neighbors described him as a reclusive individual who avoided contact, frequently moved on an old ATV, and often disappeared into the forest for weeks at a time. One person who sold him gas at a North Fork station recalled that around late 2010, Reddick paid only in cash and always carried a musty like from a dark cellar smell on his clothes. Purchase records showed Reddick buying large quantities of miscellaneous lumber and small iron materials in 2009-2011, consistent with reinforcing the cabin and installing the holding cell beneath the trap door that the investigation team discovered. Upon reviewing all biological evidence, crime scene data, and historical records, investigators realized that every detail converged on one point: the cabin was not only a place of confinement for Evan, but also a site continuously maintained over many years, a pattern only possible for someone intimately familiar with the terrain and long-term resident of the forest. Reddick, with his behavioral history, access to the area, matching footprints, cabin DNA match, old model ATV, and material purchase traces, emerged as the sole suspect fully meeting all criteria. In the comprehensive report submitted to the federal system, the investigation team officially designated Colton Reddick as the primary suspect in the nearly 5-year confinement of Evan Hartley. After Colton Reddick was identified as the primary suspect, federal forces coordinated with Glacier Rangers and Flathead County Police to immediately execute an arrest plan, prioritizing the element of surprise because his past record indicated he was highly familiar with North Fork terrain and capable of evading capture in the forest for weeks, if forewarned. The Operation Command Center mapped all plausible escape routes based on the old ATV tracks he commonly used, including narrow forest corridors paralleling the North Fork Flathead River, connecting trails up western slopes, and areas with abandoned cabins from the 1970s. UAV and satellite imagery analysis was integrated to designate 5 points where Reddick might return after the holding cabin was discovered, 2 of them deep within dense tree lines where rugged terrain favored a fugitive. The pursuit team decided to launch the operation at early dawn, when visibility was still low and high humidity dampened sound, reducing the chance of Reddick detecting the encircling force. However, upon approaching the log home where he was registered as residing, they noticed sudden signs: the back door flung open, fresh boot prints pressed into damp soil, and light drag marks, indicating he had left not long before. This forced the command team to switch to a mobile pursuit plan. A UAV was immediately launched, scanning the northern forest strip in thermal search mode. Nevertheless, Reddick proved highly adept at evading modern tracking equipment. He moved along small streams where cold water masked body heat and repeatedly ducked under thick canopy to avoid UAV detection. The only clear trace in the first hour was a fresh size 11 footprint near a stream bank, along with several snapped rose briars broken in the direction of forceful body movement, indicating he was running at high speed while carrying a large canvas bag. Experienced ranger trackers were deployed, following the direction of broken branches, depressed soil, and traces of fine powdery dust adhering to tree trunks. By near noon, support helicopters began sweeping along plausible routes Reddick might use to cross the forest eastward. From above, observers spotted a lightly flattened clearing, evidence an ATV had recently been parked there. Judging that Reddick might return to use his old ATV to gain speed, the pursuit team split into two prongs. One group continued trail pursuit, while the other circled westward to block terrain routes that could allow the suspect to accelerate on ATV. By late afternoon on the first day, the UAV recorded an unusually fast-moving heat signature, but the area was too dense for low helicopter approach. When ground teams reached the site, they found only fresh tire tracks. Old model ATV treads matching those at the cabin, leading into rocky hills. Nightfall made the pursuit more hazardous, but the command team decided not to halt, as Reddick could breach the forest boundary if given rest. The UAV switched to enhanced infrared mode, while trackers continued following torn vegetation, broken limbs, and subtle signs such as slipped moss-embedded soil. By dawn on the second day, the Western team detected faint metallic clanging from a mountain cleft, likely an ATV stuck, or the suspect carrying heavy gear. As the team closed in, overhead UAV scan confirmed a heat signature hiding beneath a large pine. Recognizing the suspect could no longer maneuver the ATV due to steep rocky terrain, the pursuit force formed a semicircle containment, gradually tightening the perimeter. Reddick attempted to flee northward, but trackers anticipated his intended descent into the valley. A tactical team blocked the head, forcing a direction change, while the rear group pressed in. The helicopter illuminated with spotlights from above, disorienting Reddick. After more than 48 hours of continuous chase, the suspect was cornered in a dry stream bed, surrounded by rock walls and natural barriers. While attempting to climb a steep rock bank, he slipped, fell, and was subdued by the pursuit team without serious injury. The arrest operation concluded with Colton Reddick being handcuffed and escorted out of the North Fork forest, exhausted but conscious. This marked the end of the evasion by a suspect considered extremely dangerous and terrain-savvy, while opening the next legal phase of the Evan Hartley, nearly 5-year confinement case. Immediately after Colton Reddick was arrested and transferred to the Flathead County Detention Center, federal forces coordinated with investigators specializing in long-term confinement suspects to conduct the first interrogation, focusing on reconstructing how Reddick approached, abducted, and maintained the confinement of Evan Hartley for nearly 5 years. Initially, Reddick completely denied everything, claiming the cabin was not his property and that he had never met Evan. However, when investigators presented cabin photos, camouflage trail maps, and DNA matches to his profile, Reddick shifted to admitting he knew of the cabin, but insisted it wasn't used to hold anyone. Investigators moved directly to the timeline, asking Reddick to describe his whereabouts on September 14, 2010. Reddick claimed he was hunting on the western slope of North Fork, far from Glacier, but when pressed for witnesses or verifiable proof, he merely repeated that alone in the forest doesn't need witnesses. This was immediately noted as having no evidentiary value. When cross-referenced with 2010 weather conditions, investigators found contradictions. The area Reddick claimed to have been in had recorded light rain and high humidity, making hunting nearly impossible, while his statement described dry ground, easy to track game. This discrepancy indicated he either lacked accurate recall of conditions or deliberately fabricated an inconsistent story. Moving to the cabin, investigators presented physical evidence including chains, iron bed, trapdoor, and wall tally marks in the basement. Reddick then claimed the cabin had once served as a winter camp for transient hunters and that the marks were left by others. When asked to name those individuals, he provided no identities, only vaguely saying, "Plenty of forest people." Investigators continued questioning about the trapdoor, a clearly reinforced metal structure used for soundproofing. Reddick insisted he didn't know it existed, despite the cabin being small and having only one room. To test the truthfulness of his statements, investigators showed Reddick a cabin schematic and asked him to point out features he didn't know. Reddick misidentified the window orientations entirely and failed to recall the number of interior log walls, a sign he was avoiding cabin details for fear of contradicting evidence. When shifting to the cabin DNA, investigators revealed that Evan's DNA matched at multiple locations such as bed railings, floor near chains, and walls. Reddick immediately claimed anyone could have left DNA there, but when the second sample matching his own profile was disclosed, Reddick lost composure, clenching his hands and changing his demeanor. Investigators noted this shift for further exploitation when questioned about size 11 footprints near the cabin and old ATV tire tracks. Reddick stated he had wandered nearby a few years back, but cross-referencing ATV manufacture year, lumber purchase year, and trail repair year showed all timelines abnormally aligned within 2009-2011, precisely before and after Evan's disappearance. The interrogation team pressed, "If you didn't use the cabin, why were both the main trail in and the side access path created by your own hand?" Reddick replied he only cleared paths for hunting, but this conflicted with vegetation cuts bearing marks characteristic of military entrenching tools, tools later found in his possession upon arrest. When analyzing evidence, investigators confronted Reddick with irrefutable detail. The time tally marks in the cell spanned consecutive years, perfectly aligning with Evan's disappearance period. Reddick said he didn't know who carved them, but forensic examiners determined the wood scratches ran outward. Only someone locked inside the cell could produce such marks. Contradictions mounted when investigators asked why the cabin was reinforced for soundproofing and light blocking. Reddick merely answered, "I don't remember clearly," an unacceptable response in a major felony interrogation. After more than 6 hours of timeline, evidence and DNA cross-checking, the overall picture showed Reddick's statements completely incompatible with any objective facts. Every explanation he offered contradicted investigative data from weather, locations, tire tracks, footprints, to cabin evidence. Investigators concluded his statements were unreliable and deliberately evasive. The full file was then transferred to the federal prosecution team, with sufficient elements to constitute charges of prolonged unlawful confinement, federal kidnapping, and related violent crimes against a citizen within national park boundaries. The case's severity was elevated to the highest level, officially paving the way for federal court prosecution. The federal trial took place in the fall of 2016 in Montana, where the prosecution presented the entire chain of evidence gathered over nearly a year of investigation. It began with medical forensic records describing severe malnutrition, abnormally reduced bone density, wrist and ankle impressions, and injuries consistent with prolonged restraint in confined space. Followed by environmental forensic reports proving soil under Evan's fingernails contained North Fork-specific mineral components, wood ash indicating enclosed burning inside the cabin, and fungal spores confirming prolonged dark, damp conditions, all ruling out survival in the wild and reinforcing controlled confinement. Next came cabin evidence: trapdoor, subfloor cell, fixed chains, iron bed, nearly 5-year tally marks, and Evan's DNA on multiple surfaces, plus the second DNA matching Reddick. Digital evidence followed. The final photo at 11:22 showing a figure standing behind Evan and 3 recovered video frames displaying rapid human-shaped movement toward the camera, proving Evan was approached immediately before vanishing. Witnesses were called in sequence, starting with Evan's family, describing his post-return changes and corroborating scars, impressions, and psychological responses, matching expert assessment. The hikers who encountered Evan in 2010 testified before the jury, confirming no natural conditions could cause Evan to vanish in minutes without trace. Medical experts presented findings of pathologically low vitamin D, lower limb muscle atrophy, and bone damage, indicating extreme mobility restriction over years. Environmental experts described how soil, ash, and fungal spore components precisely matched the holding cabin. Digital forensics technicians explained data recovery processes, proving the figure behind Evan was not noise but an external presence appearing right before disappearance. The cabin crime scene lead investigator described the cell structure, evidence collection, and why the cabin could only be operated by someone intimately familiar with North Fork terrain. In the trial's most critical moment, Evan was called to testify. In a weak but steady voice, he described fragmented memories of the early confinement months, sudden attack, bound hands, loaded onto an ATV, head covered during transport, followed by years in the narrow, lightless cell, fed only through the trapdoor slot, completely unaware of time, and repeatedly hearing the heavy footsteps of his captor, consistent with size 11 footprints around the cabin. Though Evan's memories were incomplete, each fragment he recounted aligned with physical traces, timeline, and forensic evaluation, forming a tightly linked logical chain between victim testimony and investigative evidence. The defense attempted to argue the cabin could have been used by multiple people or that Reddick's DNA appeared due to environmental coincidence, but federal prosecutors countered with statistical data showing near-zero probability of DNA match coincidence, plus footprints, cabin materials, trail repair marks, and lumber purchases all aligning with Reddick's 2009-2011 activities. Most critically, mixed DNA on the trapdoor contained skin cells from both Reddick and Evan, placing them in the same space in a timeline consistent with the case. After 2 weeks of trial and 3 days of deliberation, the jury unanimously found Colton Reddick guilty on all counts. Federal kidnapping, prolonged unlawful confinement, serious bodily harm, and operating an illegal detention facility within national park proximity. This verdict became the pivotal milestone of the case, confirming the forensic evidence chain presented by the prosecution as consistent, reliable, and sufficient to prove Reddick was the one who held Evan Hartley captive for nearly 5 years. 2 weeks after that verdict, the sentencing hearing was held in a federal courtroom under heightened security measures, with Evan's family, the prosecutors, and the core investigative team all present. The judge considered the severity of the conduct, from the prolonged period of confinement to the permanent injuries Evan would carry for life, along with Reddick's complete lack of remorse throughout the trial process, before imposing the maximum sentence allowed under federal law: life imprisonment without parole, without sentence reduction, and ineligible for any form of release. The judge stated that Reddick's actions far exceeded any ordinary criminal standard, demonstrating calculation, concealment, and cruelty sustained over many years, while emphasizing that the discovered confinement cabin was not merely evidence of deprivation of liberty, but of a purposeful, continuously maintained, and deliberately operated regime of captivity. Before delivering the final ruling, the prosecution once again presented the long-term impact of the case. Bone injuries, physical emaciation, anxiety disorder, startle responses, and years of complete isolation from the outside world. A representative from Evan's family was permitted to speak, describing the prolonged anguish throughout the period he was missing and the arduous journey of recovery, affirming that a life sentence was necessary to ensure community safety. When given a final opportunity to speak before sentencing, Reddick remained silent, offering neither apology nor rebuttal, an omission noted by the court as reinforcing its assessment of his ongoing dangerousness. After pronouncing the sentence of life without parole, the judge signed an order closing the entire federal investigative file related to the kidnapping and confinement offenses, moving the case into the execution of sentence phase. Physical evidence, including the cabin, items from the confinement room, and digital data was archived in federal storage for potential future reference in similar cases. Reddick was immediately handcuffed following the sentencing and handed over to the U.S. Marshals, in accordance with strict protocols for high-risk inmates. He was then transferred to a maximum security federal correctional facility under special management conditions and with no community contact. With this ruling, the kidnapping and confinement case of Evan Hartley officially concluded legally. All evidence was confirmed in court. The perpetrator received the highest penalty under federal law. The investigative file was closed, and justice was established nearly 6 years after Evan disappeared from the Glacier Trail in 2010. After Colton Reddick was sentenced to life without parole and the entire investigative file was closed, the case moved into a prolonged phase of assessing the enduring consequences Evan Hartley faced, while simultaneously triggering systemic changes in search and rescue operations at Glacier National Park. The clinical psychologist monitoring Evan assessed that, although he had escaped the nearly 5-year confinement environment, conditioned defensive reflexes remained strong. Evan struggled to sleep in darkness, still startled at metallic sounds, and habitually scanned for exits whenever entering enclosed spaces. His memories of the captivity period existed in fragmented, disjointed pieces, but each recalled fragment triggered intense physiological responses: elevated heart rate, shortness of breath, cold sweats. These reactions aligned with the hypervigilance syndrome, commonly seen in long-term captivity victims. Physically, although Evan's weight had increased and bone density gradually improved, some injuries became permanent. Chronic left knee pain from an untreated old fracture, prolonged morning stiffness and mobility issues, and overall reduced physical strength that prevented him from returning to wilderness photography as before. In the first year after the trial, Evan focused intensively on psychological therapy and physical rehabilitation, living with his parents in Helena to avoid strong triggering environments. His family had to adjust their entire household routine, reducing noise, avoiding sudden bright lights, and always announcing movements within the home to prevent startling him. Even so, Evan demonstrated significant effort to regain control over his life. He practiced meditation, breathing exercises, worked with specialists who had treated war captives, and began documenting the memories he could piece together from his captivity period. Evan's slow but steady recovery became an inspiration in the Montana community, especially as national media published in-depth analyses of the case, highlighting his resilience and the major changes in how park authorities handled missing persons incidents. Glacier, which had closed the 2010 file under presumed deceased, implemented comprehensive reforms to its SR program. A dedicated suspicious disappearance review unit was established to evaluate anomalous factors from the outset, avoiding automatic assumptions of natural accidents in cases without a body. Infrared scanning systems and UAVs were integrated into search protocols within the first 12 hours, rather than relying solely on foot teams as before. The park also created an expanded map of abandoned cabins, old hunting camps, and unregistered structures in the North Fork area to prevent unauthorized use, while increasing patrol frequency on unofficial trails. The Evan Hartley case created pressure that forced nationwide park agencies to re-examine the common assumption that no trace equals sign accident. In SAR professional conferences from 2017-2018, Glacier was cited as a textbook example of the need to consider criminal intent in any disappearance occurring near isolated wilderness boundaries. For the local community, the case left a deep mark. North Fork residents, accustomed to isolated living, confronted for the first time the reality that an individual could operate a confinement site deep in the forest they passed through daily without anyone noticing. Community education campaigns on wilderness safety, recognizing suspicious behavior, and anonymous reporting procedures were intensified. Schools, scouting groups, and outdoor organizations introduced new training sessions on avoiding unusual approaches while hiking in remote areas. Evan's family, after years of crisis over his unknown fate, could finally close the legal chapter of the case, but they continued the long journey of helping him reintegrate. Evan's mother established a small fund to support families of long-term missing persons, providing legal and psychological counseling during search phases and partnering with nonprofits to host workshops on recognizing signs of unlawful confinement in remote communities. As for Evan himself, by 2017, as his health stabilized further, he chose to participate in a support program for long-term missing persons victims, not as a speaker, but as a living witness, sharing what he wished he had known before entering Glacier National Park in 2010. With expert guidance, he developed field awareness notes, risk identification notes for moving in wilderness environments, focusing on abnormal signals hikers should notice, such as unauthorized trails, unregistered cabins, or signs of human presence in areas where none should be. Evan's contributions were quickly embraced by the hiking and nature photography communities, valued not only for their practicality, but also for the weight they carried from someone who survived one of the rarest long-term captivity cases in national park history. By the end of 2018, although Evan's mental health had not fully recovered, it had reached a level allowing him to live independently in a small apartment on the outskirts of Helena. He avoided crowded places but gradually returned to professional work in safer forms, photo color correction, online teaching, and collaboration on natural resource conservation projects. Though he could not yet return to Glacier, he occasionally joined short therapeutic hiking outings with support groups, working to rebuild a sense of control in outdoor settings, a process his doctors considered vital for long-term recovery. The case's impact spread widely enough that national and international media continued to reference it as a prime example of SARE assessment gaps, as well as the power of multidisciplinary forensics in resolving seemingly closed files. In-depth analyses in print and television affirmed that the Evan Hartley case changed how Glacier approached missing persons incidents, while underscoring the reminder that even in majestic natural environments, danger can sometimes come from humans rather than rock and terrain. The story concludes with the image of Evan, no longer the young photographer of 2010, but a man moving forward cautiously yet steadily on the path of reintegration. And with Glacier, which ultimately repaired the vulnerabilities that once allowed a victim to vanish without trace, now operating with more advanced and rigorous AR protocols, marking profound change following a case that shook the entire Montana community. The story of Evan Hartley, a wilderness photographer who vanished in Glacier in 2010 and was found nearly 5 years later in captivity, is not only a rare criminal case, but also reflects many sobering realities of contemporary American life. The incident illustrates a simple but often overlooked truth. This vast country contains wilderness areas where the boundary between safety and danger is far thinner than we imagine. And sometimes the threat comes not from nature, but from another human being, as in the case of Colton Reddick. Evan did not go missing due to an accident. He was approached by another individual just minutes after the last hikers saw him, a detail underscoring that even frequently visited areas like Logan Pass carry hidden risks. The evidence found in the cabin, from chains to wall tally marks, demonstrated prolonged captivity, reminding us of the importance of personal vigilance, especially during outdoor activities. Additionally, Evan's post-rescue reactions, startling at metallic sounds and fear of darkness, reflect the profound psychological consequences kidnapping victims may carry for life, a reminder that communities should offer greater understanding and support to those recovering from trauma, rather than expecting an immediate return to normal life. The case also drove systemic SR reforms at Glacier, such as UAV deployment and expanded human factor missing person evaluations, showing that change occurs only when communities and agencies confront their own mistakes head-on. The lesson for every American is therefore, when you notice something unusual, an unregistered cabin, a camouflaged trail, suspicious behavior, report it. Timely intervention can save a life, just as it could have for Evan. This holds true in everyday life as well. Observing, listening, and taking proactive action can protect ourselves and our communities from invisible dangers we sometimes prefer not to face. Thank you for following the journey of loss, but also tremendous resilience of Evan Hartley. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other important real case stories. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring lessons to help each of us live safer and more aware lives.